Here. First of all, I'd like to say welcome, Representative Blue. Welcome back to Fed and State. And to start off, do we have any bill introductions this morning? Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I believe I have RS 3282, which is a Sunrise Provision Act, and allowing due process for new regulation certification.
Can you state your name for the record?
Representative Laura Williams.
Thank you. Body, any questions? Without objection, entered. We're going to go ahead and open up a hearing on HB 2807. Mike, would you like to give us a quick rundown on that? I think we're pretty familiar with it.
Mike Heim with the Revisor of Statutes Office. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is a bill that would anticipate a Article 5 convention. The first section says the provisions of the act basically apply whenever an Article 5 convention is called. Section 2 of the bill is definition section. Section 3 are how the delegates are appointed. All the delegates would be legislators. There's a provision about how they would be recalled in the section 3. If there's a vacancy, how they would be vacancy would be appointed and so on. Section 4 is kind of the meat of the bill. It provides that each delegate and alternate shall affirm an oath to support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Kansas. The delegate appointed by the Speaker would be the chairperson, and the one appointed by the President of the Senate would be vice chair. Only the chairperson or vice chairperson, if the chairperson is unavailable, may cast a vote for the delegation. The votes have to be approved by a majority of the delegates. No delegate shall consider or vote for an unauthorized amendment. A vote cast by a delegation on an unauthorized amendment would be considered void. Section 5 deals with rules and how they could be adopted. 5B provides a revisor of statutes, or the revisor's designee would attend the convention and serve as legal counsel. The chief clerk of the House or the chief designee, the secretary of the Senate, and so on, shall prepare a daily report of the sessions of the convention. Section 6 provides the delegation shall be considered a voice of the legislature. Section 7 provides for compensation. Section 8 provides it shall be a violation of Section 4 for a delegate to vote in favor of an unauthorized amendment. Provides a coordinating council will review allegations of a violation of Section 4 and could report a violation to the Attorney General recommending further investigation or prosecution. A violation of Section 4 would be considered a severity level 6 non-person felony, which would be presumptive probation, assuming the legislator didn't have a prior felony conviction. Anyway, that's the brief overview. You've got a brief that's not very brief that I handed out to the committee. So,
thank you, Mike. Body, is there any questions? Representative Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike, I'm over here counting up on your brief how many total delegates and alternates. I haven't got all the way through yet, but I did get stuck on number 3. The majority party caucus, is that the majority leader, or would the caucus then be the one to elect or select?
It's the caucus is the way I read it. Representative Carpenter is here to maybe clarify what he intends.
Okay, and then the second question is if, say, the Speaker Pro Tem's appointment cannot make it then is it his alternate that then goes in, or does the chair, which would be the speaker, be the one to select who the alternate is to come in?
It's only if the delegate can't serve that the alternate would take the place of the delegate, and then there would be another appointment of an alternate delegate.
Okay, thank you.
And the person that originally made that appointment would make that second reappointment, if I'm correct. Representative Hastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Mike, I think in section 4, you started naming staff. Do you know how many staff members that is? You mentioned chief of staff advisor.
How many staff would be? I don't know if the bill really deals with the number, but the revisor's office would provide legal counsel for the delegation.
So are they appointed to go? Like you would be appointed to go?
I doubt if I'd be appointed to go, but anyway, it would be the revisor's office in considering with the legislative leadership how many would go and so on, or it leaves open the possibility for hired counsel as well, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. You mentioned that the bill addresses the compensation for the delegates. What does it say? How much?
The Section 7 on page 3 of the bill be paid amounts for expenses, mileage, and subsistence as provided in the statute book. So I think next year the legislature is due for a pay raise, so it would be whatever that would be.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
Any other questions for Mike? Not seeing any. Thank you, Mike. And first up, going to be Speaker Pro Tem, Representative Blake Carpenter. Welcome, Blake. Welcome back.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members of the Federal and State Affairs Committee. It's always great to be back in Fed and State, one of my favorite committees that I ever served on. Okay, so I'll get to your guys' questions in just a minute, but I'm going to go through the overall spiel. I did not write a fancy speech this time. I've decided to spare you folks from that. So overall, there's 11 delegates that would be selected for this delegation. And as we have debated Article 5 resolutions in the past, that's kind of its own thing, separate, I would say, from this. This is just the reason why myself and Representative Eric Smith started working on this is because there's been times in the past when we've had that debate and people are going, okay, well, what is the delegate selection process? It's not defined. What about the possibilities of a runaway convention? And so this is seeking to help put those worries at ease is really what we're trying to do here. Whether this constitutional convention maybe have under Article 5 were to happen next year or 300 years from now, we're just trying to define this basic set of standards on how we would carry that out. Now, as we drafted this, the thought came to my mind of what happened at the original constitutional convention. Well, it was state legislators. It was state legislators who went to the convention. They all met. I know that there's been bills in the past that had appointments from the governor, had appointments from the attorney general and other people. But as I thought about it, and as we thought about it, to me, it was more of a legislative-led process. And so that is the reason why you will see this being a legislative function, because at the end of the day, it's the legislatures that will ratify any amendments that come through Article 5, either through Congress or through a convention process. The governors and the attorney generals have no say, or anybody else have no say in what gets ratified in the U.S. Constitution. It is the state legislatures. So that's why I felt it was appropriate to make this a state legislative-led process, because it is ultimately us at the end of the day who end up ratifying these said amendments. So a little bit of background. In 2017, I actually went out to Phoenix and was a part of the there was actually a convention that was held out there at their state capitol. And so I was the only individual that went for the state of Kansas. I was the official individual at the time, and it resulted in what's called the Phoenix Correspondence Commission. It still exists today. It just allows states to communicate with each other, that type of thing. Well, during that time, we were basically meeting as almost like a Article 5 planning process for a balanced budget amendment. And I ended up meeting with some individuals from Indiana. And those individuals, when you started talking to them, I was like, well, hey, yeah, we're talking about term limits, all this other stuff. He goes, whoa, I can't talk about that. I go, okay, why? He goes, I can only talk about balanced budget amendment items. And so I thought that was fairly rare. So I inquired further. And he goes, well, we passed a law in Indiana that said if we go to any of these types of Article 5 conventions, we are only authorized to discuss what we are here to discuss. We are not authorized to discuss passing anything else, passing any other amendments. And he goes, as a matter of fact, it is a non-person felony if I decided to do that, and I can get recalled and ultimately kicked out of office. So it's been with me since 2017, what they do in Indiana. So the last section of this bill, you'll see that felony in here as well. So we basically took language from what Indiana does to try to help with prevention of the runaway convention concern. So if we send a delegation and members of that delegation say, well, we want to repeal the First Amendment. I vote aye, Mr. Chair, to repeal the First Amendment. That individual can now be removed from the delegation and ultimately brought up on potential charges with a vote of the LCC and possible prosecution by the Attorney General. So that is trying to get at the heart of the issue when we've talked about this in the past of, well, what stops somebody from doing this? Well, we can stop ourselves from doing it. And so it's a majority vote. So there's 11 members. The chairperson casts the deciding vote because every state gets one vote. So California can send 200 people, but they only get one vote, just like Kansas. Everybody's equal at a constitutional convention in this regard. And so so we just put the responsibility on one individual, and a majority vote ends up ruling. Now to some questions that were asked. The appointing authorities can withdraw their delegates, and the alternate delegates go in their stead, and then they appoint another alternate delegate. And with the thought process of how the delegates were selected, so I thought about this specifically, I'm not going to speak for the other representative, how I thought about this specifically was not everybody is maybe in good graces with leadership. Maybe they don't have an inside track with the speaker or the speaker pro tem or the majority leader. And so what my thought process for this was, the speaker and the speaker pro tem are constitutional officers for the chamber, so they get appointments. And then the majority caucus and minority caucus and the minority leader. So the minority leader gets his own appointment, but the majority caucus gets 2 appointments. And so the majority caucus would vote on who those 2 individuals they want to have represent them in the delegation. Because we are a bigger body here in the House, I allocated 2 delegates to the majority caucus of the House, and 1 to the minority caucus. On the Senate side, it was 1 and 1 for the caucuses. And that, again, comes back to wanted an odd number, 11 sounded good, and for the Senate, they're smaller. So that's the reason why you see the changes in the numbers there. As far as the staffing in the revisor's office is concerned, so how I'm reading that is that the chief revisor, so Gordon Self in this instance, or the revisor's designee. So he would be able to assign or pick. He could either go himself in this scenario, or he could pick somebody to go serve as legal counsel. Again, trying to keep this in-house in the legislative body. They're nonpartisan, and they currently serve as all of our legal attorneys at this current point in time. The reason why I kept it away from the Attorney General's office is because one party or the other might not appreciate a potential partisan position. Not saying that, I know there's disagreements with the current attorney general, with various individuals and parties in the room, that type of thing. But again, if this is 50, 100 years from now, it's not going to be the same attorney general. So we're trying to take out as much partisan legal counsel as we can and just get a simple, is this legal? Is this allowed? Am I allowed to vote yes on this? No, that's outside the call or the concurrent resolution that the legislature passed. So you cannot consider that idea. Okay, thank you. And then you can move on from there. So that was the reason for selecting the reviser of statutes office. And then ultimately our chief clerk and the secretary of the Senate are also nonpartisan staff as well. And they would then generate reports. How I see it is very similar to how House journals look or anything else. It's nonpartisan, but it gives you the information that you need on what was considered or what was done for the actions of the day. And so I think that the legislature needs to be apprised and kept up to date with all of the actions and functions that the possible convention is currently looking at. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will stand for questions.
Thank you very much. Committee questions. Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that because my first question was going to be, why wouldn't we have a statewide, like the governor, have an appointee to this? It makes some sense to me that this is a state legislative issue. I still might consider that we would want a statewide appointment on there. Thoughts as to why a statewide elected official wouldn't have an appointment to the delegation.
Yes, I believe I tried to cover that earlier on in my points, which they won't play a process at the end of the day. So they won't be involved at the end of the day. If we were to pass the 28th Amendment to the Constitution at that convention and then it goes to the states to be ratified by 38 states, it's the Senate and the House that would vote to ratify said amendment. The governor and other statewide have no say in that entire process. And so that was the reason why they weren't given an appointment in this legislation, because legislators are from beginning to end are going to be basically controlling the whole process. And they have no real say in what does or doesn't happen with the constitutional amendment.
Okay. And then my other question is, so let's say California brings a bunch of delegates. We all get one vote. California says, let's repeal the Second Amendment. And our speaker delegate casts a no vote. That delegate would be charged with a felony in Kansas, but that vote would still count. Like, even if we cast a vote, if we face charges here in the state, the vote would still ultimately count.
So the thing about it is let's say in this instance, to your scenario, California brought such an amendment. I have no doubt in my mind that there's 13 states that would say no. And so they would need 38 states to pass it out of that convention to the states for further consideration and ratification. And so in your scenario, if let's say we are talking about term limits and the call is specifically related to term limits, and somebody brings and in here, it doesn't talk about just a constitutional amendment, it also talks about rules. And so if our delegation voted to allow for something outside the scope of the convention through a rule, that would also be a violation. But what this is saying is, as long as our individual and our delegation, all of our delegation says, let's say that there's a certain faction of our delegation that wants to repeal the Second Amendment. They adamantly want to do it. Then if they voted yes within that delegation vote, they just violated what they were set and allowed to do. And so they could be recalled and then brought up on charges potentially. So that's it's all legislators within the delegation. It's not just the one person that votes. Everybody has to act accordingly to what they've been specifically called there to perform. So if it's term limits, then everybody has to focus on term limits. So if somebody says, well, I want it to be 12 years or I want it to be 18 years for a term limit on a member of the House at the U.S. Congress, then that is fine. There can be debate. There can be discussion on how long that should be or how it should be carried out. But if, to your point, someone brings up to repeal the Second Amendment, there could be no consideration. And the state of Kansas would, through its legislative, we'd pass the concurrent resolution here. And we can pass a concurrent resolution at any point in time as a legislature during the Constitutional Convention that expresses our wishes for something or our delegation to do something, and then they would have to then follow those wishes. And so what I'm saying is, you're right, they would have to vote no, but it only takes 13 states to vote no.
Okay, I guess like maybe I would direct this to the reviser then, because to me, we're limiting then if it does become a, whatever runaway convention, or the other states do decide to bring up other issues and they haven't set these parameters for their delegation, then our hands are tied to be able to provide a Kansas opinion. But even if if Kansas decides, hey, you know what, this is something we're worth going to jail over, and they cast a vote, that vote would still count, even if it's against state statute.
Well, it would be probation, and you'd lose your office because you'd be charged with a felony. But at the end of the day, we'd still our voice is still being heard by casting no. So, and if for some reason, let's say that, oh, that's a really good idea, we should take that up, then at any point in time, the body, our legislature, can pass a concurrent resolution that goes to the delegation that says, these are our wishes. And so there is some fluidity in how we can address that moving forward. Go ahead.
All right, sorry, for clarification. So this legislation would not prevent us from casting votes on other issues. That vote would still count. This just is a punishment if you do that.
Correct. You can. So here's the thing. If let's say somebody wanted to vote to repeal the First Amendment, I think we can all agree in here that the First Amendment is a good amendment. But let's say somebody wants to do it and they vote to do that, then at that point they can be brought up on punishment. But if let's say that the call for the convention is term limits and some state brings up repealing the First Amendment, then at that time, the state of Kansas, because we are there to discuss, our delegation is there to discuss term limits, would vote no on repealing the First Amendment unless they heard otherwise from us with a concurrent resolution.
Committee, further questions? Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Speaker Pro Tem, for your testimony and your justification to the panel. Sounds understandable to a degree. I'm just curious, how does this compare in your research? How does this breakdown of the delegation compare to other states?
Great question. To be honest, outside of Indiana, I didn't really take a look at how other states specifically select their delegations. And so this is homegrown and just what I thought would be reasonable.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Speaker Pro Tem. Can you address the issue of the scope of the convention? How is that determined? And can there be floor amendments outside of the scope of the convention?
Great questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will answer as best I can. So first of all, we've never had a convention. So we'd have to establish the rules for it. And how I would understand it or see it or perceive it or want it to happen is that we have similar rules to what we have here. So if we're debating something there on the convention floor and someone brings something that's not germane, then the germaneness could be challenged and it would be struck down, is how I would want it to potentially work if there's something outside the scope. And then what was your other question?
Could there be floor amendments at the convention that were outside of the scope?
Again, there's been mock conventions. I would say that in what I would expect or want is, yes, amendments could be had, because that's how you end up compromising. So, okay, let's say that the First Amendment is, or let's say the first idea is 12 years. So you get 12 years in the U.S. House and another 12 years in the U.S. Senate for a total of 24. You can't serve more than that. Okay. Well, let's say somebody brings down an amendment that says that somebody can serve 6 years in the House, go do 6 years in the Senate, and then if they flop back and forth between the two, then they can serve in perpetuity. So if somebody had an amendment like that, I would say, yeah, it's a germane amendment. It's going to allow for the free flow of ideas and conversation. But we are still there in discussing what we were called to discuss.
Right. And so what I'm asking about, would it be possible to bring up an amendment that says we ought to do away with the First Amendment to the United States Constitution? Would that be permissible to even happen at the convention?
Well, here's the thing, and this is what this legislation is trying to address: the what ifs. Because we've had these what if debates several times now under an Article 5 possibility, right? So if that comes up or somehow is allowed to happen as a possible thing for us to vote on, then our delegation would be required to vote no, because it is not a part of the scope and the call that we authorized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, further questions? Representative Clayton.
Thank you. All right. So I wasn't going to ask any questions, but then the concept of germaneness came up. So in the event that this convention is structured, and I apologize that I'm not looking at this right in front of me, I'm going to assume, who are the arbiters of germaneness?
Yeah, so I would imagine that it would be set up very similar to what we have to do to set up our own body. So you have to adopt rules that are going to govern the body. So is that Masons? Is that Roberts? And then from there, you also have to select a chair, because I'm sure, as you know, that at the first Constitutional Convention, there's a pretty big chair there. So you have to figure out who the chair is. You have to have the presiding officer. You have to set up the entire infrastructure for the convention so that it does run based on rules, so that both the minority and majority are protected. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, further questions? Representative McNorton.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to clarify, Blake, if our representative votes no because he's required to by our law, would that count still vote? If you voted yes or no, even though he's going to jail when he gets home, would that vote still count at the convention?
So here's the thing. So the chairperson would be the only individual, or vice chairperson, if the chairperson is unavailable, that can cast the vote for the state of Kansas. And so if for some reason the chairperson has indicated, because here's the thing, usually with appointments, especially something on this level of importance, I would imagine that the speaker and the president and all the other people are going to be talking to their delegates a lot. Now, let's say that my delegate, or let's say that you're the speaker, and your delegate, who's the member that's going to cast the deciding vote for the state of Kansas, says, yeah, I'm going to violate my oath. I swore an oath before I came here. I reaffirmed my oath before I came here to both the Kansas Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. Well, I'm about to break that oath. And, rules be damned. I'm okay with leaving office. I'm going to vote for the way I want to vote. You, as the appointing authority, can go, okay, you're out. Okay, alternate, you're up. And so you have the ability to remove that individual. Now, that's the only person, or two people, chair and vice chair, depending, who can cast a vote for the state of Kansas with this bill. Now, if a delegate, let's say one of the other 9 delegates, they can still cast a vote that is, say, well, forget this process. I'm gonna vote for how I think I should vote. Well, they would not be casting the official vote for the state of Kansas. They would be just casting the vote amongst the delegation for the majority. So, and again, the majority of the votes within the delegation. So let's say the delegation is torn between a 12-year term limit and a 16-year term limit, or an 18-year term limit. And the delegation votes for 18 by majority vote. Then at that point, that is how the chair would be required to vote to reflect the delegation and what their wishes are. Does that make sense?
It does. I know we don't know what the rules of the actual Article 5 convention would be, but if that person went rogue and wanted to vote themselves 100 years from now, would that vote still count as our official vote, even though he's,
Well, I guess I'm confused. So here's the thing. So at an Article 5 convention, they are basically just giving pre-approval, and then it comes to the states to be ratified. So if, let's say that something did get the 38 state requirement and it was let to the 50 states to vote on, at that point, 38 states, both the House and the Senate, except for Nebraska, because they're kind of weird, would have to then approve or ratify that amendment. And if they don't, by the 38 state margin, if 38 states don't approve it and pass it, then it does not get ratified and become a part of the Constitution. So I guess I don't understand by what you mean. If somebody cast a vote now, 100 years from now, would it still apply?
so my question is, if the chair that has the official vote for the state of Kansas votes his personal belief instead of what the delegation told him, does that count? Does that vote at the convention still get cast as a valid vote?
Well, I guess it depend on the rules. It would also depend on, I think, a few other factors, but maybe that's something we could tweak into the bill a little bit of if the majority, if the individual who is the chair goes against the majority vote, then they are removed as chair and the alternate delegate replaces them. I mean, that'd be a pretty simple fix.
But would that vote still be recorded as an official vote if you actually voted?
I believe it would. I believe it probably would.
That was just my thought.
Yeah.
I think,
unless there's some sort of motion to reconsider.
Thank you, Mr.
Committee, further questions? Seeing none?
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, we have Representative Eric Smith. Eric, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Chair Carpenter, Vice Chair Kessler, Ranking Member Hoy, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to take a little bit of time, and I appreciate your attention. I'm not going to read my testimony to you. I'm not going to go through the working parts because you've heard enough of that. But if you have questions that I can answer, I'll be glad to do that when I have that time. If I could suggest to you, when you look at this structure, this delegate selection, it's not that much different than what you've seen. And that was particularly important, I thought, when I read it, that it's not foreign. We set up task forces, special committees, et cetera, in a similar fashion. Maybe not exactly, but in a similar fashion. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel by this, but rather go through a process that Kansas is used to seeing. You're going to send a committee to a convention of states. They're called a delegation. They're all delegates, but you're actually sending a committee. They're going to have a chair, a vice chair. You're going to have a structure of folks on both sides of the aisle who are going to be able to debate these things. So when they come out on the floor, I had the honor and privilege of going to Williamsburg, Virginia this past summer for the simulation of Convention of States. There were three of us, myself, Representative Penn, and Senator Mark Steffens went to this convention, and we got to simulate what it would look like at a Convention of States. You got to see some of the attitudes that come. There are folks there that have a great deal of knowledge about Convention of States, scholars, right? Folks that get involved. And you have folks that try to interject things, and you'll see them calm, folks going over and calming them down and explaining to them that can't happen, and we've got to follow process, et cetera. It's not that much different, in my opinion, than what you see here. It is very much the same. The debate on the floor is very much the same. These are folks who have had, like myself, I've spent over a decade looking at a convention of states. It's kind of what brought me to the legislature. Well, it is what brought me to the legislature. And so it's an interest to me. And I research different ideas. Yes, there are some unknowns. We delve into unknowns all the time. This is about a delegate selection process, but no doubt, looking at your emails, to many people, it's a decision about whether or not we're going to a convention of states. Remember that Kansas has already signed on to a convention of states, the balanced budget amendment, back around 1980. So we are signed on, and we still don't have a process for how we're going to select our delegates put out there. So this is not a decision about whether or not we're going to a convention of states, but are we going to have our ducks in a row when it comes up? And so that's what I would put in front of you. The fact of the matter is, the way people are going to be paid, I think, is fair. It's exactly the way we do it already. If you get called to a special committee over the interim, you'll get paid the same way. The folks from the revisor's office, staff, they'll all get paid the same way. This is not a new way of doing business. So I think the bill we put in front of you folks is one that is reasonable and not far-fetched, not a new idea. It's the way we do business, and I would ask you to consider it that way. And I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Committee questions? Seeing none, oh, yeah. Representative Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric, you brought up a good point, and I just wanted to, how many states have ratified a convention of states for term limits and budget and balanced budget? Do you know the numbers?
I didn't know there was going to be a test.
Sorry. And you can
on-
phone a friend behind you.
The folks behind me can probably do a pretty good job of answering that question too. I know that we were very close on balanced budget, and then a few fell off. So I'm not sure where that stands now. On term limits, I'm not sure where we're at either.
And are those the only two right now that there are convention of states?
Well, those two, and then the convention of states that we proposed actually has 3 areas that we're looking at: balanced budget, federal overreach, and term limits.
Okay.
Yeah.
Speaker Pro Tem, would you like to answer that question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Per my memory, with the balanced budget amendment, as the representative alluded to, there were a few states that dropped off, but right now it's at 29, and you need 34 to make the call. And with the Convention of States project, my understanding is I think they're at 19, and that includes term limits, that includes balanced budget, and also includes federal overreach. And then I think there's one more that's kind of out there floating around right now, but I'd have to go before I talk confidently on that one.
So you have to have 34 states sign up, but you need 38 at the convention to pass anything.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for that. Further question, Representative Sanders.
And I might also point out there's currently a court case going on that might get Kansas as a yes, depending on the outcome of that case, because the federal constitution, some would argue, only require a simple majority in the legislature of the state in question. And we have a 2/3 rule. And so the courts are going to decide whether or not our vote, which was a majority, would count.
In fact, the legislature has voted in favor of the Convention of States multiple times if you go with a simple majority. One of the things I wanted to point out too, it brought to mind the idea that when we do this, when we actually go to a Convention of States, you got to know this is going to be headliner. This is historic. We have never done this with the Convention of States. So the media is going to be involved. Any decisions that are made in that convention, they're going to be on CNN repeating over and over how this and what now next has to happen. If this, it's going to be one of those things that's heavily scrutinized. So to bring it to the court, if there is any idea that something was not done correctly, believe me, somebody's going to challenge that in court. We have look at your emails. Somebody's going to challenge it. It's going to happen.
Committee, further questions? Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. Just real quick, I noticed you mentioned a few times that it would be similar to how we do business here in Kansas. That would kind of business as usual. This seems to be the delegation selection process seems to be weighted similar to how Kansas has a supermajority. 34 states out of 50 to there's 34 states and 38 states. There's a simple 2/3 majority, and then it has to be 76% majority in order for something to be passed. Will that same majority be required in the Kansas delegation, or are we looking at just a simple majority?
So my understanding is it's going to operate. It's a committee. So it will operate as a committee. It will not require 2/3 of the committee members. It will be a majority of committee members to decide how a vote will go.
Thank you for clarifying that.
You're welcome.
Committee, further questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.
Representative Smith. No, I just was correcting myself. Committee, I'll bring your attention to two written proponents from David Copeland and Ben Terrell. And now we'll have John.
Thank you, Chairman. I am John Axtell from Wichita, Kansas, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for Kansas Campaign for Liberty. Honorable Chairman Carpenter and members of the House Federal and State Affairs Committee, I oppose this bill for several reasons, but my first reason is that the bill presumes that the delegates to a convention of states or a constitutional convention under Article 5, it presumes that those delegates could be constrained. The federal court case has been mentioned already. It's a court case which is essentially suing against the Kansas Constitution's 2/3 supermajority requirement in Article 2, Section 13 for passage of things pertaining to the state or federal constitution. This lawsuit is based on court opinion. The precedent for it is based on court opinion from the 1975 Dyer versus Blair case, where the Illinois legislature itself faced a similar supermajority requirement in the Illinois Constitution. And the federal court stated in that case, in their opinion, quote, "The Illinois constitutional provision may only be precatory in its effect on the federal process, and the legislative houses are free to accept or reject the 3/5 requirement imposed by the Illinois Constitution." Now, I had to look up the word precatory, but it means merely a suggestion or a wish and having no legal force. So it says that the Constitution of Illinois is just a suggestion in its effect on the federal process. Now, what does that mean? It means when the states apply for a convention, they're participating in the federal process. So if the states are participating in the federal process when they apply for a convention under Article 5, certainly the delegates are also participating in a federal process when they're participating in the convention, when they're seated at the convention itself. And if, when the states are participating in this federal process, they are free to, quote, accept or reject, quote, end quote, the provisions of the state, the constitutional requirements or the statutes and so on. If the state legislature is free to accept or reject those provisions, then certainly the delegates are as well. And so the delegates, once they are seated, are free to do as they wish, with the words of this bill being only a suggestion, only precatory upon them, not a requirement. So the answer to the question I heard several times, will a bad vote stand? The answer, in the eyes of the federal court, who will have the jurisdiction over this issue, in their eyes, yes, it will absolutely stand. And I would question even if a delegate could be removed from the convention under Kansas statute while seated, because in the eyes of the federal court, the delegates are free to choose to do as they please. So the delegates have no constraints from Kansas once they're seated. I'd like to point out one other thing about this court opinion, and that is that they said that the Illinois legislature was free to accept the state constitution. They couldn't have stated in any clearer words that the state constitution of Illinois is not unconstitutional with respect to the federal constitution. They were not asked to rule on that question, so they didn't. But their words are absolutely clear. The state constitution's supermajority requirements are constitutional and may be abided by the state legislature. That's not the question. That cannot be a question in federal court. And I say this because it has been represented that the reason for this lawsuit is to adjudicate that question of the constitutionality of the Kansas Constitution. That could not be further from the truth, and it certainly is not supported by the court opinion from Dyer versus Blair. I also object to this bill because I see the provisions being extremely unrealistic. How would a vote be voided by the Kansas, assuming that there is some power in these words, in the words of this bill, how would the vote be voided? I can only imagine that a vote at the convention would be held. It would be closed. Once closed, that information would be sent to the panel in Kansas for review, while the convention sits and twiddles their thumbs and says, let's wait for Kansas. And when Kansas decides and sends their determination back, then the convention can resume. That seems absolutely unrealistic, even if these words were to have impact on our delegates. So for these reasons, I strongly urge you to vote against this bill. And I am glad to stand for testimony. I also thank you for your consideration of my message.
Very good. Thank you very much. Committee questions. Representative Blue.
Hi, John.
Hello, Representative Blue.
So my first question is, I'm on your guys' website right now. Is Campaign for Liberty against a constitutional or against Convention of States in general?
Yes, we believe that the Convention of States, because of what I just said, and that the fact that the delegates cannot be constrained, that there will be no constraints on the process, we've considered a dangerous thing. And we believe in, our motto, in fact, is restore the Constitution. And if we did restore the Constitution, we certainly wouldn't have the problems that concern the proponents of Convention of States. We wouldn't have the debt we have today. We wouldn't have the spending we have today. We wouldn't have all of those problems if we simply restored the Constitution, which is our motto.
So wouldn't you, if, for instance, we just heard the balanced budget is at 29, they need 5 more states to call a convention. Wouldn't you feel better about having guardrails on setting up how a delegation should be ran compared to the fear of a runaway convention?
Well, concerning, say, a balanced budget amendment and guardrails on a balanced budget amendment, again, I would say that we have a balanced budget requirement here in Kansas, right? And just a few years ago, our balanced budget requirement was met by passing the largest tax hike in the history of the state. So a balanced budget requirement, you're asking me to address an issue pertaining to something I don't believe would solve the problem. And I'm reluctant to do that because it won't solve the problem. And having guardrails on something that won't fix the problem isn't a solution to the problem. The solution to the problem is getting rid of the fiat currency that the Federal Reserve can print with abandon, hand out to its crony partners, and then we pay the debt. The solution is to get rid of the fiat currency, not to propose a balanced budget amendment. When you have a fiat currency that demands to be spent because you get the most value for your spending when you spend the money today with a fiat currency. When that fiat currency runs our country, as opposed to gold, which you get the most value for gold when you spend it in the future. When you have that fiat currency, you will be driven to spend. That's the problem. So a balanced budget amendment is not the solution either.
Well, we're going to disagree on that, just like the robocalls you're doing in my district right now. Are you an attorney?
I'm not an attorney.
I feel like you're giving legal advice, so I just don't agree with it. Thank you, Mr.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony today. So regardless of how your organization feels about a convention of states, would you agree that if a convention is in fact called at some point, either before the convention convenes or immediately when the convention convenes, that there would have to be rules set up for the convention?
Well, the the recourse that Kansas does have for delegates, is that what you're asking about? Should we establish some recourse?
Would the convention set up rules at some point?
Mhm.
It would have to be either before the convention convenes or very early on in the process. Rules for the convention would have to be established.
The convention, yes, will establish its own rules.
Okay.
Yes,
so
of course.
Here in Kansas, every time we take a final action vote, there's an opportunity to change your vote.
Mhm.
So could there be a situation at a convention of states where there would be a first vote taken and then there would be an opportunity to change your vote?
Well, yes, of course. But again, the federal court has said.
My point
but
is.
the federal court has said that there will be no constraints made by the state provisions on those participating in the federal process.
My point is there could potentially be a rule at the convention of states that the vote could be taken and then there could be a recess before, and you'd be given an opportunity to change your vote. And at that point, the delegation could remove the chair who made the rogue vote. Don't you see that as being a possibility? And that's how the delegation would control it rather than one rogue voter?
Well, yes, that presumes that it's just one rogue vote and not the whole delegation.
Oh, well,
yeah, it presumes
okay.
that
Right.
the delegation
Thank
is not
you.
rogue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mhm.
Committee, further questions? Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This discussion just made me curious, and I'd like to see if the revisor could answer this question. Looking on the violation severity level 6 non-person felony, if this convention of the states would occur during session, how would that work with legislative immunity? There wouldn't really be able to be any enforcement or arrests during session for this type of crime. So that would give the person, if it were during session, some time to get their affairs in order and things before they would face any charges.
I probably need to do a little bit more research, but just to point out that the coordinating council has to review the allegations first. So that's one step in the process. Then they refer to the attorney general, who then would review it and decide whether or not to file charges and so on. There is immunity from prosecution, but I don't know if that would extend to a felony of this level, but I can find out for you. I will point out that the court case that the speaker is referring to, I believe, is a federal district court case. It's not a U.S. Supreme Court case.
Committee, further questions? I have just one.
Yes.
So you mentioned the balanced budget, that we're already required to do that. What do you think the likelihood of that happening is?
Of a balanced budget amendment being
on
passed?
The federal level?
I don't know. I am not a good gambler, so to speak. I wish I were. I don't like to make guesses about what might happen.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Committee, further questions? Thank you very much, John. Next, we have Sean Meehan on WebEx. Sean, are you there?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your committee for the excellent questions and discussions so far. I founded Guard the Constitution 10 years ago and have spent that time specifically focused on Article 5 to try to get the truth out there. And one thing I'd like to remind everybody of is this seems to some people like an academic exercise, but I'd like us to think for a second that wherever we're at, for or against gay marriage, for or against legalization of drugs, for or against taxation, any of the important issues that Americans embrace these days, abortion, the Constitution underlies and codifies our basic values and beliefs, and is our supreme law, as the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 states. And I think sometimes that we forget this absolutely is the very most important issue of any legislature, Congress, anything in the country right now. It is the foundation of all of our other legislative debates. And in the history of our great nation, nearly 1.4 million troops have given their lives after pledging an oath to the Constitution. And I'd like us to be mindful of that. I want to thank Mr. Axtell for his excellent explanation of legislators sincerely want to and have a moral right to control your representatives that go to any convention. Sadly, the truth is there's plenty of body of law out there right now that shows that is absolutely not the case or how it will play out. It is not a convention of states. Article 5 clearly states it is a convention for proposing amendments. It's a doing business name that fraudulently gives state legislatures the impression that they control a convention. They do not. 41 times in the history of our country, Congress has asserted their right to control and define a convention. And while a threat of a convention waned, they never had to actually finally pass these bills. But I'll give one quick example. In 1973, the United States Senate unanimously passed S 1272, the Federal Convention Procedures Act. And I'll very quickly read a few excerpts from it. That delegates shall in all cases, except for treason, felony, breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at a session of the convention and in going to and from the same. For any speech or debate in the convention, they shall not be questioned in any other place. And I would also like to add to what Mr. Axtell said with another legal reference, and this is ironic because later this morning, your sister house in your legislature is debating a term limits Article 5 call. It was the 1995 Supreme Court decision, U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton, that quoted the famous Supreme Court Justice Story in his commentaries on the Constitution, where he recognized, quote, "The states can exercise no powers whatsoever which exclusively spring out of the existence of the national government, which the Constitution does not specifically delegate to them. No state can say that it is reserved what it has never possessed." Before our Constitution came into being, Article 5 didn't exist, so the state of Kansas did not have any authority in that area. Very quickly, I would like to touch on the 1787 convention. There's talk of a runaway. There's a lot of opinions. All I would like to ask you to do is to look, and I can supply this to your folks later, University of Wisconsin, Center for the Constitution, look at the original online calls or commissions that the 1787 delegates were given. Everybody reads down and they see that word, all exigencies, and the lawyers in the room will tell you that's basically the urgent emergency of the time. Yes, the delegates to 1787 were empowered. If you read further, 11 of the 12 states that went specifically said anything that came out of the 1787 convention had to have Congress and all 13 states ratify it. Those of us that know our pocket constitutions look at Article 7 and know that that final product absolutely ran away from, disobeyed those limits, and it only required 9 states. Now, Federalist 49 is very clear. The people are the fountain of all power. They did ultimately purposely ratify the Constitution. As to the representative that asked about limits and specific subject calls, I call your ladies and gentlemen attention to the United States Congress, the Judiciary Committee, House Concurrent Resolution 24 from Congressman Jody Arrington of Texas. My congressman here in Nevada told me that was going to sit there in a drawer forever. It's actually already had a hearing. It specifically consolidates all outstanding Article 5 calls from all states without regard for the subject limits of the nature of the convention and calls a wide open Article 5 convention. Courts may not touch this. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, we've got to look at all sides of what can happen. There's these simulated conventions that they're infomercials. I'll just leave that there. And a key important point of the sponsor I'll point out is this is not one state, one vote. If we have a convention, it may be Professor Robert Nadelson, a law professor retired from the University of Montana, who is considered one of the advisors nationally on the Article 5 issue, wrote in the 2013 American Legislative Exchange Council Handbook, it is one state, one vote, except that the convention, when called to order, can amend it. So that is no guarantee. And the talking to delegates, your legislature wants to talk to delegates. Amen for that. That's the right attitude. But the problem is, if you look back at 1787, you realize whether it's Mason's rules, Robert's rules, whatever, we have executive session in parliamentary procedures. They closed the doors and did not communicate with anybody. They have the authority to do that. There's a lot.
All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Committee, we're adjourned.